I'd first had the idea for a piece about ageing performed by children in 2005, so 5 years before the project finally arrived in the world. And I was pretty clear at that point that what I wanted to make was a piece about being and getting old. Through the development of the project, as well as speaking to all the kinds of people who I mentioned, we also made a space to invite expert voices into the research, people who we defined as expert. Social scientists, doctors, academics, gerontologists of various kinds, to whom we also posed that question, what can you tell us about ageing? And really it was through those conversations that my presumption that a piece about ageing was a piece about being old was challenged. I think the first conversation that I had was with Tom Kirkwood, who's the director of the Institute for Ageing and Health at Newcastle University. I asked him why people age. He told me to read his book. I said, but while we're on the phone, can you just tell me why do people age? Why we experience ageing, or why we picture ageing as physical deterioration, and when this starts. He tells me that those physiological changes that we associate with ageing begin in the womb, that the body starts to accumulate ageing-related damage before it's even born. Then we met with a clinical gerontologist called Kalman Kafetz. He used to work at Whipps Cross Hospital in North London. I asked him, with a choreographic directorial head-on, to tell me what he thought were the patterns and the rhythms and the movements of ageing from his point of view. Or what were the rhythms and patterns of being old, was my question. His answer was, there's no such thing as being old. He's a kidney specialist. He told me that, from his point of view, look at a group of 70-year-olds and their kidney function, look at a group of 7-year-olds and their kidney function, and the group of 70-year-olds is by far the most diverse group. That physical diversity increases as we age, and that therefore, from his point of view, there is no such thing as being old, as though all old people are the same. Later we talk with Maria Evandrou, the director of the Centre for Research on Ageing at the University of Southampton. She's a social scientist. With Maria we talked about life course, about the experience of ageing at all stages of life and across and between generations. She stresses that from her perspective, ageing is a lifelong phenomenon, one that everyone has a relationship to, and that manifests itself everywhere, from social relations to intergenerational contact, education, policy, healthcare, and for me, most importantly, for the project, most importantly, in that infinite array of tiny interactions and awarenesses that constitute daily life. So through those conversations, which were challenging ones with those experts who we invited to talk with us, we found ourselves rethinking the project. How could we make a piece about being old when ageing is something that starts in the womb, applies to all stages of the life course, and when the idea of a homogeneous group of old people is challenged by healthcare practice itself? But what would it mean for us to make a piece about ageing as living, about ageing as it's experienced across the life course, from being a child to being middle-aged to being elderly to death? One of the ways that we approached that was through an idea of accumulation, an accumulation of stuff which filled our pristine performance space, an accumulation of experience, an accumulation of knowledge or of memories, or an accumulation of physical and physiological change, and an accumulation of time just spent being alive. That felt really clear, but at the same time we were trying to work out what's the point of this project. What are we trying to do? What are we trying to say? Why do we want to say it? And I guess that's what brought us round to thinking about death. In the end, in proposing that ageing is just the everyday activity of getting on with living, the project, like this conference maybe, was working against the social and cultural disavowal of ageing, and it acknowledged that at the root of this disavowal was the spectre of death. In one of the very first research workshops that we did in a primary school in Lambeth in central London, we gave a group of 8 to 10-year-old children, each of them a disposable camera, and asked them to take photos of ageing, which we would then develop and we'll talk about in a later session. So developing one of those films, we were surprised that Joe, an 8-year-old boy, had taken a photo of the school's anatomical skeleton. For Joe, ageing and death were just the same thing. And so we took that image, Joe's image, of the implicit relationship of ageing and death, and worked that spectre into the piece. In the proposition for this conference, Liz has written, "By the time death's upon us, most of us still won't be ready for it, even if we're elderly. It seems curious that this one certainty about our lives, its end, could remain unplanned for, unanticipated even, by the majority of us." In aligning death with ageing, and by making ageing the province of other people, old people, people who are not me, we simultaneously disavow both dying and ageing. So maybe the thing that we worked out we were trying to say was a question. Could it be that in recognising, acknowledging and embracing ageing as central to living, by embracing our own ageing, from being a baby to being somebody on the verge of the limit of life, can we also make a space to contemplate, recognise, acknowledge and embrace the inevitability and imminence of our own death? So there was a kind of a speculative process going on for us as we were making the piece, trying to work out ultimately what we were doing, what it was for. But also we were doing something quite practical and quite concrete. We were making a show. We were making a show and we knew there was going to be an audience turning up at a certain date and we had to be ready. And we knew that we were making a performance. That was the form that we'd chosen for this project. Now, performance is interesting in this context, I think, because maybe more than some art forms, it's one which is absolutely built on the fact of its own disappearance, its own nightly death. This is one of the things that I value most about performance as a performance maker, that every time I create something, I lose something, that in the act of beginning a project, I'm anticipating that final performance, the final fade of the lights, and the moving on to something new. So I've learned a lot about living with absence and disappearance and loss and death by living for a long time with performance. And working in that form, it also became really clear to us that we were working with a number of groups of people. There were the people whose voices you heard and were heard in the performance, those people of all ages who we spoke to about ageing. There were the children who performed the piece, and there was the audience in the theatre. And I think with that group of people, we became very aware that what we wanted the piece to be was an actual embodied experience of ageing in the theatre, in the 80 or so minutes of the piece's presentation. And these 3 groups of people came together in this space to contemplate each other, to hear and see each other and reflect on each other. So the piece created a relationship between different groups of people of different ages, an intergenerational relationship. Of course, as well as being a spatial and a physical form, performance, as I've said, is temporal. And it allows us, and it allowed us in this project, to explore ageing and time through the event of the show itself. Ooh. It's not super clear in this picture, I apologise, but one of the things that happened during the kind of arrival of these waves of objects was the arrival of 5 TV sets, which were showing films of natural and geological events, events which operate on a timescale other than the human, rocks being eroded by the sea, the natural cycles of flowers coming into bloom and decaying, clouds moving over the sky. So we wanted to bring timescales which were other than ours into the piece, and for the audience to experience those timescales. On these 5 TV sets, those images took their own time. We made spaces in which there wasn't very much going on. We let the audience just wait and watch and kind of wait a little bit more and get a little bit bored. And then eventually things would start going on again. And similarly, the choreography of these objects that filled the space was repetitive and real. It wasn't dramatic. We didn't really look for a well-structured, forward-moving, dramatic pace or narrative. We kind of weren't interested in that. We allowed the piece to ebb and flow and drift around a little bit. And if people got bored, they got bored. We wanted to make a space for people to spend time with things and to heighten that sense of time passing. That sense of time passing, a sense of time spent living, a sense of time spent aging, time in which things changed, whilst sitting there, maybe a little bit bored, waiting, and watching, and waiting for something to happen. I think in the end what we tried to make was very, very simple, simply a performance that just electrified a multitude of tiny moments, tiny objects which might resonate with people as an object that relates to a moment in life or in history or in their personal histories, fragments of text, fragments of light and sound and film, bits of time spent kind of doing nothing. Simply to propose, as time passed, that ageing, as I said, is not necessarily a slow decline into decay and death, but just the really ordinary and at the same time totally extraordinary process of just getting on with being alive.